Dr. Alara Vance understood the architecture of silence. There was the brittle silence of a waiting room, thin as glass and just as easily shattered. There was the heavy, weighted silence of a consultation room after delivering bad news, a silence that absorbed sound and light. And then there was the silence she lived in, the one she carried inside her scrubs like a second invisible stethoscope. It was the quiet exhaustion of long-term suffering, a soundproofed room she had built around her own spirit, brick by patient brick, insult by ignored insult. Today, that silence was failing. Its walls were cracking. Through the fissures, she could hear the frantic, tinny beat of her own heart. She stood in the third-floor corridor of Metropolitan General, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and microwaved coffee. Her hands, the same hands that had just spent 7 hours inside a human chest, performing a radical aortic reconstruction of her own design, were trembling slightly. She clasped them behind her back, a posture of forced serenity. She had learned long ago that in a world determined to see her as angry, serenity was her sharpest weapon. The surgery had been a masterpiece, a symphony of precision and innovation, a procedure. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the hospital's chief of cardiothoracic surgery, had declared needlessly risky and theoretically unsound in a departmental meeting just last week. He had dismissed her proposal with a condescending wave of his hand, his signet ring catching the light. He had not updated the file on her. He was working from a version of Alara Vance that had never been accurate to begin with, a file that listed her as a diversity hire, a box to be checked, not a peer to be respected. She had performed the surgery anyway. The patient, an elderly woman with a formidable will to live and a case file that read like a death sentence, had been out of options. Marcus had washed his hands of it, leaving the inevitable to Alara. He had expected her to fail. He had, she suspected, counted on it. A tidy way to remove a subordinate who was becoming inconveniently brilliant. But she did not fail. The patient was stable in the ICU, her vitals stronger than they had been in a decade. The surgical team was still buzzing, a hive of hushed awe and adrenaline. They knew what they had just witnessed. They knew whose hands had achieved it. And now, here came Marcus. He moved down the corridor with the proprietary swagger of a man who believed he owned the very floor tiles he walked on. His silver hair was perfect. His blue scrubs were impeccably tailored. He was a man who performed competence, who wore authority like a cologne. Today, the scent was sour. He was not smiling. He stopped directly in front of her, blocking her path. He was close enough that she could see the tiny broken capillaries around his nose, the faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He was radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the hospital's overworked HVAC system. It was the dry, crackling heat of fury. "My office." "Now," he said. His voice was low, but it sliced through the corridor's low hum. A few nurses paused, their carts suddenly very interesting. Alara kept her own voice level, cool, the temperature of polished steel. "I'm on my way to check on my patient, Dr. Thorne." "Your patient?" The words were a sneer. "You went against a direct recommendation. You performed an unsanctioned procedure. That woman is the hospital's liability now, and you are mine." She did not rise to the bait. She did not defend herself. Explaining her reasoning to Marcus was like describing color to a man born blind. He lacked the capacity for comprehension. The patient is stable. The procedure was a success. "A success?" He laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "We'll see what the board has to say about that. We'll see what they think about your little freelance project." He gestured vaguely with his chin. "I already filed the preliminary report, documenting your insubordination." The cold dread that had been a low hum in her blood began to crystallize. A report. A formal mark on her record. He was trying to bury her, to bury the procedure itself, and claim the salvageable pieces of her research as his own later. It was his pattern. He was a vulture who circled brilliance, waiting for it to falter so he could pick the bones clean. The data logs, the surgical video, my notes. They all clearly outline the necessity and success of the procedure, she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. She was fighting for her career, for her patient, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. "Your notes," he scoffed. He took a step closer, invading the last bastion of her personal space. "Your notes will be attached as an appendix to my paper on the theoretical application of hybrid graphs. You had an interesting idea. You got lucky, but you were reckless. I'll make sure the final report reflects that I had to step in to manage the fallout." It was so audacious, so breathtakingly dishonest, that for a moment Ilara could only stare at him. He was rewriting history in real time. He was not just stealing her work. He was framing her for a crime she had not committed, a failure that had not occurred. She finally allowed a sliver of ice to enter her voice. "You weren't even in the operating theater." "I was overseeing the entire department, as is my job." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "And my report will be the official record. Unless you want to make this easier on yourself." He produced a tablet from the large pocket of his scrubs, the screen already glowing. On it was a document, a transfer of intellectual property rights, a confession of recklessness, couched in legal jargon, and an acknowledgement of his oversight and guidance. "Sign it, Ilara," he hissed. "Sign it, and I'll make the insubordination charge go away. I'll even give you a co-author credit, a footnote. It's more than you deserve." She looked from the glowing screen to his smug, expectant face. This was it, the breaking point, the moment she either surrendered the last piece of her professional soul or went to war. The silence inside her finally shattered, and what rushed into the void was not fear, but a cold, clear, diamond-hard rage. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. His face tightened. The mask of civility dissolved. "Don't be a fool. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I built this department. I sit on the promotions board. I can end you." "Then end me," she replied, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, he seemed to be at a loss. He had expected tears, pleading, negotiation. He was not equipped for defiance. His system crashed, and then it rebooted into pure, primitive rage. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into the muscle just above her elbow, a grip of steel and fury. "You will do as you are told." She did not scream. She did not struggle. Her body went rigid, all her energy focused into two words: let go. The corridor had gone quiet, not her internal protective silence, but a new kind. A sharp, observant silence. The nurses had stopped pretending to be busy. A junior resident, half hidden behind a pillar, was watching with wide, horrified eyes. They were all watching, and none of them were moving. They were afraid of him, too. They had all seen his petty tyrannies, his career assassinations, his explosive temper. They were bystanders to their own quiet subjugation. Marcus saw their attention, and it fueled him. He was performing now. He was making an example of her. "You have an obligation," he snarled, tightening his grip. "An obligation to this hospital and to me." The pain was sharp, a blooming fire in her arm, but it was distant. The real injury was the humiliation, the sheer, naked aggression of it in the middle of her workplace, a place she had given everything to. She was about to say something else, something that would undoubtedly get her fired and possibly escorted out by security, when a new sound entered the tableau. It was not a loud sound. It was the soft, almost imperceptible clink of a heavy glass being set down on a marble-topped table. It came from an alcove just down the hall, a small private waiting area for VIPs. The sound was nothing, and it was everything. It cut through the tension like a scalpel. Marcus flinched, his head snapping toward the noise. Ilara's gaze followed his. A man was rising from a low leather armchair. He did not rush. He was not performing. He moved with a kind of liquid stillness, an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that was so perfectly cut it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hair was dark, his face a collection of severe, handsome angles. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine about acquiring countries, not in a hospital corridor. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps out of the alcove and into the main thoroughfare. The ambient light of the hallway seemed to bend around him, dimming everywhere else. Conversations that had started to whisper back to life died instantly. The hushed reverence that usually followed a code blue announcement now filled the space. It was a power shift so sudden and so absolute, it was almost a physical force. Marcus Thorne's hand was still on Alara's arm, but his grip had gone slack. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of shock. He recognized the man. Everyone in the hospital's upper administration would recognize him. Alessandro Volkov. The name itself was a form of currency. He was a phantom, a myth who sat at the top of a global empire, Volkov Global. He was the hospital's single largest benefactor, the man whose name was carved in gold leaf on the donor wall in the main lobby, the final and most powerful arbiter of this institution's fate. He was known for his ruthlessness in business and his obsessive privacy. To see him here in the flesh was like seeing a lion calmly walk into a petting zoo. Alessandro's eyes, a shade of dark, impenetrable slate, did not look at Marcus. They looked at the point of contact, at the white-knuckled hand clamped around Alara's arm. His expression did not change. He showed no anger, no surprise. He simply observed, as if cataloging a data point. Then his gaze lifted and met Alara's. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in their depths. Not pity. Recognition. It was the most disorienting feeling she had ever had, to be in the midst of her own public vivisection and feel, for the first time all day, truly seen. He spoke. His voice was low, a quiet baritone that carried no hint of aggression, and yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Take your hand off her. It was not a request. It was a statement of what was about to happen. It was a correction of a cosmic error. Marcus froze, his brain clearly unable to process the command. He was a chief of surgery, a man of authority. He was not used to being told what to do, but the man in front of him did not operate on the same plane of authority. Marcus was a regional manager. Alessandro Volkov owned the company, the supply chain, and the air rights above the building. Mr. Volkov, Marcus stammered, his hand dropping from Ilara's arm as if it had been burned. I was just handling a disciplinary matter. An internal staff issue. Alessandro's eyes finally moved to Marcus's face. The lack of expression was more terrifying than any rage. It was the blank, placid face of utter indifference, the kind of look one gives an insect before crushing it. You were not, Alessandro said, his voice as steady as iron wrapped in silk. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The simple negation was a complete and total invalidation of Marcus's entire reality. 2 other men had now materialized behind Alessandro. They had not been there a moment ago, and yet they were. Dressed in dark, conservative suits, they moved with the same unnerving lack of wasted motion as their employer. One of them had an earpiece. The other's eyes were scanning the corridor, noting the witnesses, the security cameras, the exits. They were professionals. What they were professionals at, Ilara did not want to guess. Alessandro gave a nearly imperceptible nod in Marcus's direction. He did not look at the men. He did not have to. See that Dr. Thorne finds his way to the parking garage, Alessandro said, his gaze still locked on Marcus. His employment here is terminated. His access has been revoked. Dimitri will handle the paperwork. The man with the earpiece, Dimitri apparently, was already on his phone. His lips moved silently. He was not making a request. He was issuing commands. In the background, Ilara heard the faint ping of an elevator being summoned. Marcus sputtered, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white. You can't. I have a contract. The board. I am the board, Alessandro stated, the words delivered with the flat finality of an obituary. As of this morning, he turned his attention back to Ilara, dismissing Marcus so completely it was as if the man had ceased to exist. The second man stepped forward and placed a calm, firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. It was not a violent gesture, but it was immovable. The promise of overwhelming force was held in reserve, making its application unnecessary. Marcus, for all his bluster, was a coward. He recognized a predator when he saw one. He sagged, defeated. All the performed power drained out of him, leaving a small, sagging, middle-aged man in expensive scrubs. He allowed himself to be guided away, a ghost being exorcised from the halls he once haunted. The corridor was a vacuum of stunned silence. The nurses stared. The resident was still frozen behind the pillar. Ilara rubbed her arm, the ghost of Marcus's grip still burning on her skin. She was in shock, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, terrifying relief. Alessandro Volkov stood before her. The chaos had been ordered, the threat neutralized, all with a few quiet words. This was a different kind of power. It was not the hollow, performed power of Marcus Thorne, which was loud and brittle. This was deep, quiet, structural power, the kind that didn't need to shout because it was the foundation everything else was built on. "Are you all right, Dr. Vance?" he asked. His use of her name, her correct title, was a bomb. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "Good." He looked around the corridor at the lingering audience. His gaze was not unkind, but it was clear. The show was over. The nurses suddenly remembered urgent tasks. The resident scurried away. Within seconds, the corridor was empty except for the two of them and the silent Dmitri, who was still murmuring into his phone. "Come," Alessandro said gently. "Let's go somewhere more private." He led her not to an office, but to the suite from which he had emerged. It was the hospital's finest, reserved for its most important patrons. The air inside was cool and quiet, smelling faintly of lemon and old money. A massive window looked out over the city, the afternoon light turning the distant skyscrapers to gold. Ilara stood awkwardly in the center of the room, feeling out of place in her simple scrubs. She was a surgeon. She was comfortable with blood and bone and the intricate mechanics of the human heart. She was not comfortable in rooms like this with men like him. He did not fuss over her. He simply went to a small, concealed refrigerator and retrieved a bottle of water, twisting the cap off before handing it to her. His movements were precise, graceful. "Thank you," she managed, her voice raspy. She took a sip. The cold water was a shock to her system, grounding her. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said, taking a seat in one of the armchairs. He gestured for her to take the other. "I was merely correcting a personnel issue." She sat, perching on the edge of the plush cushion. "He was my department chief. You just fired him." "He put his hands on you," Alessandro stated, as if this explained everything. To him, perhaps it did. "And he was attempting to steal your work. I heard the entire conversation." He paused, his slate-gray eyes studying her. "The procedure you performed today, it was on my mother." The world tilted on its axis. The patient. The elderly woman with the fierce will to live. Katerina Volkov, Alessandro Volkov's mother. The disparate pieces of her day clicked into place with a sickening lurch. Your mother?" "Yes. She is resting now. The prognosis, I am told, is excellent." He said it with no emotion, but Ilara could hear the carefully buried undertone of relief. "Thanks to you." "I was just doing my job," she said, the automatic self-effacing response she had been trained to give. "No," he corrected her, his voice soft but firm. "You were doing the job no one else could or would. My mother's case was complex. Dr. Thorne was content to let her die comfortably. You were not." He knew. He knew the politics, the cowardice, the professional sabotage she had faced. He had not just stumbled into a random argument. He had been observing, gathering information. His intervention was not an impulse. It was a calculated, decisive action. "My mother is aware of this as well," he continued. She is a formidable woman. She has a keen understanding of character. She was quite taken with you even before the surgery. She asked me to extend an invitation. Alara blinked. An invitation? To dinner, at our home. This Friday. He watched her, gauging her reaction. She wishes to thank you personally. She is insistent. Dinner with the Volkovs, in their home. The idea was absurd. It was a collision of worlds she could not begin to comprehend. Her world of sterile operating rooms and quiet, lonely evenings with her daughter, and his world of silent power and unimaginable wealth. And then, a new current of panic, colder and deeper than anything Marcus Thorne could ever inspire, shot through her. Dinner. Friday. Alessandro Volkov. She thought of a humid summer night 6 years ago. A charity gala she had attended on a borrowed ticket and in a borrowed dress. A power outage that had plunged the grand ballroom into darkness and chaos. A chance encounter on a darkened terrace with a man whose face she never clearly saw, whose name she never learned. A man with a low, quiet voice and a stillness that felt like gravity. They had talked for hours, two anonymous souls finding a moment of connection in the dark. It had been reckless, a single uncharacteristic departure from the careful, controlled path of her life. A single night that had resulted in the most precious, most terrifying, most wonderful secret in her life. Her daughter, Luna. Luna, who was 5 years old and had a mind as bright as a supernova. Luna, who had a small, determined chin and a habit of observing the world with a quiet, unnerving stillness. Luna, who had her mother's smile and a pair of slate-gray eyes that were a perfect mirror image of the man sitting across from her. Alara's blood ran cold. He didn't know. Of course he didn't know. How could he? She had vanished from that life, buried herself in her residency, moved to a different city. She had built a fortress around her small world for two, protecting her daughter from a past that was a mystery. And now the mystery was sitting in an armchair, inviting her to dinner. Dr. Vance? Alessandro's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Is Friday not suitable? She looked at him, truly looked at him, searching his face for any sign of recognition. There was none. To him, she was the doctor who had saved his mother. Nothing more. He was working from an incomplete file. Her first instinct was to refuse, to make an excuse, to disappear back into the safety of her anonymity. But then she thought of Marcus Thorne. She thought of the report he had been forcing her to sign. She thought of the years of quiet slights, of stolen credit, of being told to wait her turn. Alessandro Volkov had swept all of that away in 30 seconds. He had offered her a shield, but shields had a price. Dependence was a cage, even if it was gilded. But what was the alternative? To fight alone? She was so tired of fighting alone. And then there was Luna. Her daughter deserved to know her father. And her father, whether he was a mafia boss or a corporate titan or both, deserved to know the magnificent child he had helped create. But it had to be on her terms, in her time. A decision formed, cold and clear, in the center of her fear. She would not run. She would not hide. She would do what she always did. She would face the complication head-on, with precision and control. She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. Friday is perfect, Mr. Volkov. He gave a slight, satisfied nod. Excellent. My driver will pick you up at 7. That won't be necessary, she said, a hint of her own authority returning to her voice. I'll drive myself. Just send me the address. He looked surprised, then faintly amused. It was clear he was not used to people refusing his arrangements. As you wish, doctor. She stood up, the empty water bottle still in her hand. She felt like a soldier accepting the terms of a truce on a battlefield that had suddenly, inexplicably, turned in her favor. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on my patient, she corrected herself. On your mother. Of course. He stood as well. Ilara. He used her first name. It was not familiar or presumptuous. It was quiet, deliberate, a signal. He will not bother you again, he said. It was a promise, a vow. Your work will be recognized. I will see to it personally." She looked at this powerful, dangerous, unknowable man, the father of her child, and for the first time in a very long time, she believed it. She believed that the silence she had lived in for so long might finally be filled with something else. Not noise, just peace. But peace was a distant shore. First, she had to navigate the storm. "Thank you, Alessandro," she said, testing his name on her tongue. It felt both foreign and familiar. She turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, her steps even. She did not run. She was not a woman who ran from complications. She was a woman who dissected them. And this Friday, she would walk into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a physician with a consultation, and she would be bringing his secret with her. The drive to the Volkov estate on Friday evening was like a journey to another planet. The city's familiar grid of streets gave way to winding country roads, flanked by old stone walls and ancient, sprawling trees. The GPS directed her up a long, private drive that was more like a tunnel carved through a dense forest. Finally, she arrived at a pair of immense wrought iron gates. They were an intimidating work of art, all black steel and sharp, elegant spikes. She stopped her sensible, decade-old sedan before them, feeling suddenly and profoundly out of place. A small, discreet camera swiveled to look at her. A moment later, a voice crackled from a hidden speaker. It was a woman's voice, old and accented. "You are the doctor?" "Yes," Alara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Dr. Alara Vance." There was a pause, and then a heavy, grinding sound as the gates began to swing silently inward. "Come," the voice said. "Katerina is waiting." Alara drove through, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The drive opened up into a circular courtyard paved with pale gravel. In the center stood a fountain, water whispering over moss-covered stone. The house itself was less of a house and more of a grand, old-world manor, built of granite and draped in ivy. It was imposing, but it didn't feel cold. It felt anchored, like it had grown out of the earth itself. She parked her car next to a gleaming black Bentley that looked like it had been polished with diamonds. She took a deep breath, the air here clean and smelling of rain and pine. She turned and looked into the back seat. Luna was looking out the window, her small face a mask of intense concentration. She was wearing her favorite dress, a simple navy blue jumper that matched her serious eyes. Her dark curls were held back by a single silver clip. She was not fidgeting. She was observing, processing, like her father. "Are you ready, Sweet Pea?" Alara asked softly. Luna turned her slate-gray eyes to her mother. "Is this a castle, Mama?" "It's a big house," Alara corrected gently. "We're here to see the lady I helped feel better, remember?" "Katerina," Luna said, pronouncing the name with perfect, solemn clarity. That's right. Alara's decision to bring her daughter had been a terrifying one. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. It could be seen as an ambush, a demand. But to come without her felt like a lie. Luna was not a weapon. She was a fact, the most important fact of Alara's life. To hide her would be to accept that she was something to be ashamed of. And Alara would never, ever let her daughter feel that. She got out of the car and opened Luna's door. The little girl took her hand, her small fingers wrapping trustingly around her mother's. Together, they walked toward the massive front door. It opened before they reached it. An elderly woman stood in the doorway. She was small and stout, dressed in a simple black dress, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes were bright and sharp. It was the woman from the gate. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice warm and raspy. She was not the patient. This must be a housekeeper. "Welcome." Her eyes fell to Luna, and her stern expression softened instantly, melting into a wide, delighted smile. "And who is this little angel?" "This is my daughter Luna," Alara said. Before the woman could respond, another voice called out from within the house. "Is that her, Maria? Is that my miracle worker?" The patient. Katerina Volkov. She appeared in the grand foyer, leaning lightly on a silver-topped cane. She was wearing a flowing caftan of deep emerald green that made her look like royalty. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, and her eyes, a warm, intelligent brown, sparkled with life. She looked nothing like the frail woman Alara had first met in a hospital bed. "Dr. Vance!" Katerina boomed, her voice full of operatic warmth. She opened her arms wide. "Come here, come here. Let me look at you." Alara hesitated, then stepped forward and allowed the older woman to envelop her in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and sheer gratitude. Katerina held her at arm's length, studying her face. "Beautiful," she declared, "and so young to hold so much genius in your hands. Alessandro told me what that vile man Thorne tried to do. Do not worry. He will be selling cheap pharmaceuticals in a backwater country by next week if he is lucky." She said it with the casual finality of a queen ordering an execution. Then, her eyes moved past Alara and she saw Luna. Katerina Volkov froze. The smile on her face did not falter, but it changed. It became something softer, more profound. Her gaze fixed on Luna's face, on her dark curls, her determined chin, and most of all, on her impossibly familiar slate-gray eyes. Katerina's own eyes filled with tears. She took a shaky breath, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from Luna to Alara and then back to Luna. A million questions and one stunning, unbelievable answer bloomed in her expression. "Oh," she whispered. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and wonder. "Oh, my dear God." It was at that exact moment that Alessandro Volkov walked into the foyer. He had changed from his suit into dark trousers and a soft, gray cashmere sweater. He looked younger, less severe. He was smiling, a faint, rare thing that softened the hard lines of his face. "Mother," he began, "you are supposed to be resting." His smile vanished the moment he saw the scene before him. He saw Alara looking pale and resolute. He saw his mother weeping silently, and he saw the small child standing beside Alara, a child who was looking directly at him with a calm, curious expression. A child who had his eyes, the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. It fell over the grand foyer, thick and heavy as velvet. Alessandro's face became a blank canvas. All emotion, all expression was wiped away. But Alara could see the shock in the sudden stillness of his posture, in the way his gaze was locked on Luna, as if she were a physics problem he could not solve. He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate. And the update was standing right in front of him, 5 years old and wearing a navy blue jumper. Luna, who was afraid of nothing, finally spoke into the crushing silence. She tugged on Alara's hand. "Mama," she whispered, her voice carrying in the vast space. "He looks like the man in my photograph." Alara's heart stopped. The photograph. A single, blurry, candid shot from that gala 6 years ago, taken by a friend. A picture of a man in silhouette on a terrace, his face obscured by shadow. It was the only image she had. She had kept it for Luna, for the day she would have to explain. She never imagined that day would be today. Alessandro took a single, slow step forward. He crouched down, not taking his eyes off Luna until he was at her level. He was not smiling. He was not threatening. He was just looking. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. Luna considered him for a long moment. "Hello," she replied, her own voice just as serious. "Are you my father?" The question was a detonation in the quiet room. It was innocent, and it was devastating. Alessandro did not flinch. He did not look at Alara for confirmation. He just kept his eyes on the small, serious face in front of him. A dozen emotions flickered across his face, too fast to read. Shock, confusion, denial, and then a slow, dawning, staggering acceptance. He saw his own father in her chin. He saw his own unnerving stillness in her posture. He saw himself in her eyes. Yes, he said, the word raw, as if it had been torn from his soul. I believe I am. Katerina let out a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh. She moved forward, her cane forgotten, and wrapped her arms around both Alessandro and Luna, pulling them into a messy, tearful embrace. A granddaughter, she wept. You brought me a miracle, and then you brought me a legacy. Alara stood apart from the tangled knot of her new, terrifyingly complicated family, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had walked into the lion's den, and the lion had just discovered he was a father. She had no idea what came next. Dinner was a surreal affair. They ate in a smaller, more intimate dining room at a long table of dark, polished wood. The housekeeper, Maria, served a simple, delicious meal of handmade pasta and roasted vegetables. The conversation was stilted at first, punctuated by the enormity of what had just been revealed. Katerina, however, was in her element. She had recovered from her shock and transitioned seamlessly into the role of doting grandmother. She directed all her questions to Luna, who answered them with her typical solemn honesty. "Do you like to draw, little one?" "Yes. I like drawing stars and hearts. The human heart. It has 4 chambers." Katerina laughed with delight and looked at Alara. "She is yours, through and through." Alessandro was quiet. He sat at the head of the table, a king at rest in his castle. But he was not eating. He was watching. He watched the way Luna carefully cut her food. He watched the way Alara would gently push a stray curl from her daughter's face. He watched them with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply tender. He was a man recalibrating his entire universe. Alara, for her part, felt strangely calm. The worst was over. The secret was out. There was no more hiding. She found her voice and began to speak, not about Luna, but about her work. She told Katerina about the specifics of the surgery, about the polymer she had used for the grafts, about her theory on cellular regeneration. She spoke to the old woman, but she knew Alessandro was the one who was truly listening. He was leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was not just hearing her words, he was understanding them. He was seeing the complex, brilliant architecture of her mind, the one Marcus Thorne had tried so desperately to demolish and claim as his own. "The problem is funding," she said, forgetting for a moment who she was talking to. To move to human trials for the regenerative therapy would require millions, a dedicated lab, a team. It's a decade-long project. "So build it," Alessandro said quietly. Alara stopped, confused. "What?" "Build it," he repeated, his gaze intense. "The lab, the team, whatever you need, write a proposal, give it to me on Monday. Volkov Global has a biotech division. It is now yours to command." She stared at him, speechless. It was not an idle offer. It was a directive. He was handing her the keys to a kingdom she had only ever dreamed of. It was not a gift to the mother of his child. It was an investment in the genius of the surgeon. He was separating the two things, respecting them both. It was the most profound gesture of respect she had ever received. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Katerina chimed in, beaming. "My son is many things, but he is not a man who makes idle offers. He sees value. And you, my dear girl, are a diamond." Later, after Luna had finally fallen asleep in Katerina's lap, exhausted by the excitement, Alessandro walked Alara to her car. The night air was cool, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the whisper of the fountain. "I am not a man who is easily surprised, Dr. Vance," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "Please, call me Alara," she said softly. He nodded. "Alara, I was not prepared for her." He looked back toward the house, where his mother was no doubt putting his daughter to bed in a guest room that would likely become her permanent own. "You kept her from me." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I didn't know who you were," she answered honestly. "You were a man on a terrace in the dark, a memory. I had no name, no way to find you, and even if I had..." She trailed off. Even if you had, you would not have come to me. He finished for her, his insight unnerving. You are not a woman who asks for help. I don't leave because things become complicated, she said, her voice firm. I built a life for us, a good life, a safe life. And I am grateful for that, he said, his sincerity absolute. You have raised a remarkable child. You have done it alone. You will not be alone anymore. He paused. I will not try to take her from you. I will not make demands, but I would like to be her father. If you and she will allow it, I will earn that right. She looked at his face in the pale moonlight. He was not the arrogant tyrant Marcus Thorne was. He was not the performative alpha male. He was something far more dangerous and far more safe. He was quiet, sovereign power, and he was offering her not a cage, but a fortress, a partnership. She has your eyes, Alara said quietly. She asks about you. She deserves to know you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And I, it seems, deserve to know her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently open her car door. Drive safely, Ilara. Dimitri has sent the proposal template to your email. I expect it on my desk Monday morning. As she drove away, back through the whispering forest and the imposing gates, Ilara felt a sense of vertigo. Her world had been turned upside down, shaken, and reassembled into a new and unfamiliar shape. She had gone to the Volkov estate expecting a test, a confrontation. She had left with a job offer that would change the face of medicine, and with the father of her child vowing to earn his place in their lives. The silence she had carried for so long was gone. In its place was a symphony of new and terrifying possibilities. In the following weeks, Ilara's life transformed. True to his word, Alessandro was a quiet but constant presence. He did not overwhelm her. He moved with a patient, observant grace. He called every evening to speak with Luna. He sent flowers to her apartment, not extravagant bouquets, but single, perfect gardenias, her favorite, a detail he must have somehow learned. He also dismantled Marcus Thorne's life with the quiet efficiency of a controlled demolition. Marcus was not just fired, he was disgraced. An article appeared in a major medical journal detailing an investigation into systemic plagiarism and data falsification within the Metropolitan General Cardiothoracic Department, all tracing back to him. Old lawsuits that had been quietly settled were suddenly reopened. The publisher of his best-selling textbook issued a recall. Alessandro was not just removing a threat, he was salting the earth where it had stood. Ilara watched it all from a distance with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She spent her days in a whirlwind of activity, drafting the proposal for the new research institute. It was the work of her life, a chance to pour all of her ideas, her innovations, her frustrated genius onto the page. She worked with a feverish intensity, driven by the stunning, terrifying reality that someone was finally ready to listen. Marcus Thorne, however, was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a creature of pure, malignant ego. From his perspective, he had been unjustly persecuted, a brilliant surgeon brought down by a vindictive, social-climbing subordinate and her wealthy lover. His arrogance blinded him to the reality of the power he had provoked. He saw Alessandro Volkov not as a sovereign force of nature, but as a rival. He believed the situation was reversible. He hired a private investigator, a seedy man who promised to dig up the dirt on Ilara Vance. Marcus was convinced she had a sordid past, a secret he could use as leverage. The investigator's report landed on his desk a week later. It was thin. Ilara's life was, on the surface, unremarkable. Top of her class, spotless record, no vices. But there was one detail that made Marcus's heart leap with vicious glee. A daughter, 5 years old, no father listed on the birth certificate. He stared at the photograph of Luna that the PI had taken from a distance. The child had dark, curly hair and slate-gray eyes. Marcus was not a fool. He had seen Alessandro Volkov up close. He recognized the eyes. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile, This was it. This was his weapon. He hadn't been fired for incompetence. He had been fired because his brilliant subordinate was sleeping with the hospital's benefactor and had passed off her illegitimate child as his. It was a perfect, sordid narrative, a story of ambition, sex, and betrayal. A story that would ruin Ilara Vance's credibility and, he hoped, embarrass Alessandro Volkov enough to make him retreat. His opportunity to deploy this weapon was coming, the Obsidian Gala, the hospital's largest and most glamorous annual fundraising event. It was the jewel of the city's social calendar, and he knew, with a certainty that bordered on madness, that Ilara would be there, on Alessandro Volkov's arm. He would confront them, publicly. He would expose the lie and reclaim his throne. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of a lifetime of underestimating his opponents. He thought he was walking into a battle. He was walking into a pre-dug grave. The night of the Obsidian Gala arrived on a wave of cool autumn air. The event was held at the city's modern art museum, a cavernous space of white walls and soaring glass ceilings. The elite of the city were there, a glittering constellation of wealth and power. Ilara stood beside Alessandro near a towering abstract sculpture, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. She was wearing an architecturally precise gown of midnight blue silk, a gift from Katerina. It was a dress that did not ask for attention, but commanded it. For the first time in her life, she felt correctly placed. She was not an imposter. She was not a diversity hire. She was Dr. Ilara Vance, the soon-to-be director of the Volkov Institute for Cardiovascular Innovation. Her proposal had been accepted without a single revision. Alessandro was a study in dark elegance, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It was a gesture of quiet possession and of profound protection. Katerina was nearby, holding court and showing pictures of Luna on her phone to anyone who would look. "He's here," Alessandro said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. Ilara's body tensed. "Who?" "Thorne." She scanned the crowd and saw him. He was standing near the entrance, looking disheveled. His tuxedo was ill-fitting, his face flushed. He was drinking, and he was scanning the room with a hunter's desperate gaze. He looked like a ghost haunting the scene of his own demise. "Why is he here?" she whispered. "How did he get in?" "I made sure he could," Alessandro replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Some problems are best dealt with in the light." He was springing a trap, and Marcus Thorne was walking right into it with a staggering, drunken stride. Marcus spotted them. His eyes narrowed, and he began to move through the crowd, his path a clumsy, determined line. He was a missile of mediocrity locked on its target. He reached them, pushing past a state senator without apology. "Well, well," he slurred, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look at you, all dressed up. You clean up nice." He looked Ilara up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Alessandro did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, his stillness a stark contrast to Marcus's agitated energy. "Having a good time?" Marcus continued, his voice rising. "Enjoying the fruits of your labor?" He practically spat the last word. People were starting to turn, to notice the disturbance. "Marcus, you're making a scene," Ilara said, her voice low and firm. "Am I?" He laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "I think the scene is just getting started." He turned to Alessandro. "You think you're so clever, Volkov. You think you can just buy whatever you want, but you don't even know what you bought." He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. "You think she's some kind of genius? Some kind of saint? She's a user, a parasite. And she has been lying to you." The area around them had gone quiet. The music seemed to fade into the background. This was the public confrontation Marcus had dreamed of. "She has a child," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "A 5-year-old daughter. No father on the birth certificate. A child she's been hiding. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself who she's trying to fool." He leaned in, his breath sour with whiskey. "She's probably not even yours. She probably just saw an opportunity, a rich man to solve her problems." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. He was using Luna. He was using her daughter as a weapon against her in a room full of strangers. The cold, diamond-hard rage she had felt in the hospital corridor returned, magnified 1,000 times. But before she could speak, Alessandro moved. He did not touch Marcus. He simply shifted his body, placing himself slightly in front of Ilara, a living shield. He looked at Marcus Thorne, and for the first time that night, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was not anger. It was a profound clinical pity, the kind of pity a god might feel for a particularly stupid insect. "You are mistaken, Dr. Thorne," Alessandro said, his voice quiet, yet it carried through the silent room. He turned to the assembled crowd of onlookers. "Many of you know me only as a businessman, but tonight I am here as a grateful son." He gestured to Ilara. "This is Dr. Ilara Vance. Last month, she performed a revolutionary surgical procedure that saved my mother's life. A procedure that our hospital's former chief of surgery, Dr. Thorne, declared impossible and attempted to block." A murmur went through the crowd. "Dr. Vance is not merely a competent surgeon," Alessandro continued, his voice resonating with calm, unshakable authority. "She is a visionary. Which is why, next month, Volkov Global is breaking ground on the Vance Institute, a $300 million research facility that she will design, build, and direct to continue her life-saving work." He let that sink in. He was not defending her. He was crowning her. Then he turned his full, undivided attention back to Marcus. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "You speak of her child," Alessandro said, his voice now laced with ice. "Her daughter's name is Luna. She is 5 years old. She has my eyes. She is the greatest gift I have ever received, a gift I did not know existed until a few weeks ago. You are correct that Dr. Vance raised her alone. She did so with a grace and a strength you could not possibly comprehend. You see her as a parasite. I see her as the most capable person in every room she has ever entered." He took a small step closer to Marcus. "You came here tonight to expose a lie, but the only lie here is you, Dr. Thorne. Your entire career has been a lie." Alessandro raised a hand, and Dmitri materialized at his side, holding a tablet. "You believe you were unfairly dismissed," Alessandro went on, his voice a low, devastating monologue. "You were not. You were a liability. My team has compiled a rather extensive file on you, 3 separate instances of academic plagiarism, dating back to your residency, 7 surgical procedures in the last 5 years that resulted in malpractice claims, all quietly settled by the hospital's former board to avoid a scandal. A board, I should add, that my conglomerate now controls." Marcus's face had gone from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. He was trembling, no longer from rage, but from sheer terror. "The textbook you are so proud of," Alessandro continued conversationally. "The publisher was acquired by a Volkov subsidiary 2 days ago. They are currently preparing a press release about the fraudulent data in chapters 3, 7, and 11. The National Medical Board received a comprehensive file on you this afternoon, delivered by my attorneys. I suspect your license to practice medicine will be revoked by Monday." He paused, delivering the final crushing blow. "You came here tonight to ruin Dr. Vance's reputation. But you have no reputation left to leverage. You have no job. You have no book. By the time the markets open in the morning, your pension fund, which was heavily invested in a biotech firm I acquired last week for the express purpose of liquidating its assets, will be worthless. You are not just fired, Dr. Thorne. You are erased." It was a public execution, a complete and utter annihilation, delivered not with a sword, but with a balance sheet. Marcus Thorne made a small, choking sound. The arrogance, the bluster, the rage, it all collapsed inward, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a man. His legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the polished marble floor of the museum, his body shaking with racking, uncontrollable sobs. He was a king deposed, a tyrant stripped bare in the court he once ruled. He did not beg. He was too broken to even speak. Two of Alessandro's men moved forward, lifted the weeping man to his feet as if he weighed nothing, and escorted him out of the gala. They moved without wasted motion, their faces impassive. They were not security guards removing a drunk. They were undertakers removing a corpse. The room was utterly silent. Then someone began to clap. It was Katerina. She was on her feet, her eyes flashing, applauding as if she had just witnessed the final act of a magnificent opera. The applause spread, hesitant at first, and then thunderous. It was not for the destruction of Marcus Thorne. It was for Ilara. Alessandro took her hand. It was no longer trembling. He led her through the stunned crowd toward the small stage at the front of the room. He stepped up to the podium, bringing her with him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and clear over the microphone, "allow me to properly introduce you to the future of cardiovascular medicine, the architect of the Vance Institute, my partner and the mother of my daughter, Dr. Ilara Vance." He turned the podium over to her. The light was bright, the faces in the crowd a blur. For years she had worked in the shadows, her brilliance ignored or stolen. Now she was standing in the light, the entire world waiting for her to speak. She looked at Alessandro, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She saw Katerina in the front row, beaming with pride. She thought of Luna, asleep in a big, safe house, a child who would now grow up knowing both her parents. The silence within her, the old, protective silence of endurance, was gone forever. In its place was a new silence, a quiet confidence, a sense of rightness. She leaned into the microphone and began to speak. Later that night, long after the gala had ended, Ilara stood on the wide stone terrace of the Volkov estate. The city glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of distant lights. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. She was wrapped in a cashmere blanket and in a profound sense of peace. Alessandro came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the city together. "Was that necessary?" she asked finally, her voice soft. "The public humiliation, the complete destruction." "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "Some diseases cannot be cured. They must be excised, completely, so they cannot grow back." He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "He threatened you. He threatened our daughter. There is no line I will not cross to ensure that never happens again." It was the most terrifying and the most comforting thing anyone had ever said to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single heavy key attached to a simple leather fob. "This is for you," he said. "The key to the institute?" she asked. "No," he said. "That will be a key card. This is the key to this house, to the gate. It is not an obligation. It is an option, a place of safety, for you and for Luna, always." She looked at the key in her palm. It felt solid, real. It was not the key to a gilded cage. It was the key to a sanctuary. She closed her fingers around it. "Thank you." "I should be thanking you, Ilara," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely showed. "You gave me a daughter. You gave my mother back her life. You have brought light into a very quiet house." He reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was light, respectful. It was not the touch of a lover, not yet. It was the touch of a partner, a co-conspirator, a man who had seen her value and reflected it back at her 1,000-fold. "I meant what I said. I will earn my place in your lives." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust she wouldn't have thought possible a month ago. They stood in the quiet darkness, two complicated people who had found each other through a storm of chaos and violence. The passion would come later, perhaps, but this, she thought, was more important. This was peace. This was safety. This was the slow, steady dawn of a new beginning. A few weeks later, Ilara stood in the doorway of Luna's new bedroom. The walls were painted the color of a pale evening sky, and glow-in-the-dark stars were stuck to the ceiling. Luna was tucked into bed, her dark curls splayed out on the pillow. Alessandro sat on the edge of the bed, a book open in his hands. He was reading to her, his low baritone a soothing rumble in the quiet room. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity that it brought a lump to Alara's throat. This was her life now, this quiet, safe, beautiful reality. He finished the page and looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. He didn't smile, but his gaze was full of a warm, steady light. He had kept his promise. He was earning it, every day, in 100 small, quiet ways. She thought about the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of peace. It was the feeling of being home. She gave him a small, real smile, one that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners. He gave a slight nod in return. No words were needed. They were a family, not by accident, but by choice, not by obligation, but by a slowly growing, deeply rooted love. And their story was just beginning.